Before I begin, if you want to get right into the game, go ahead and skip to Chapter 1. There'll be no gameplay here, the preface is for introductions only. With that out of the way, let me introduce myself, or rather, why I'll be playing the game I'll be playing. In 1992, I bought my first computer, an IBM PS1. It's sitting in front of me right now. I didn't have any games for it besides what few it came with and a handful of shareware titles. My 10th birthday was in early January 1993. We went to Lechmere's, which was a regional chain, sold mostly electronics, for two things. Firstly, a CD-ROM drive to replace my 5¼ inch floppy. Secondly, for a couple of new games. One game had already been decided on, the recently released CD version of King's Quest V. The other came down to whatever box art stood out the most. It was found in a display in the center of the aisle near the front of the software section. Alone in the Dark. The game had been released not 2 months earlier. The front cover promised a spooky adventure game with a period setting, but it was the back that sold it. 4 screenshots that looked entirely unlike anything I'd ever seen on my Nintendo. Cinematic is the only word I can use to describe how those screenshots seemed. Now, for the game's introduction. Alone in the Dark was created by Frédéric Reynal and released by the French video game company Infogrames. The North American floppy disk version was released in November 1992, and a CD-ROM re-release came out 2 years later in '94. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Alone in the Dark, a game significant in the history of PC gaming, in that it was one of the first games to use true 3D graphics, and the first to use not only 3D wireframes or shaded primitives, but fully rendered, recognizably human characters made out of polygons. It was also the first game to incorporate sound effects that were actual recordings, real footsteps, creaking doors, grunts, and groans, for example. The technology behind the game was built upon an earlier Infogrames title, Alpha Waves, which Reynal had ported from the Atari ST to the PC in 1990. Alpha Waves is a simple maze platformer based around 3D primitives, mostly cubes. Alone in the Dark benefited from 2 pieces of technology, both created in 1989 and widely adopted in the early 90s, the 486 processor and the Sound Blaster sound card, which were only beginning to be fully exploited by game makers. Alone in the Dark is an adventure game, one with action elements, but an adventure game at its heart, with a heavy emphasis on story and on puzzle solving. It's mostly known, and I'm quoting from the box now, for being inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. To say the game was a success is an understatement. It sold 2.5 million copies, a staggering number for the time. It created an entirely new genre, survival horror, and spawned not only its own series of sequels, but was the direct inspiration for series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, series that have now nearly eclipsed their originator. Finally, an introduction to this Let's Play. In keeping with the text-heavy nature of the game, I've adopted some literary conceits. How will it be structured? It begins with the preface you're watching right now. The actual playthrough will comprise 5 chapters. Each chapter will be preceded by a prologue. These prologue videos will feature gameplay of different but related games. Each chapter will then conclude with an epilogue. The epilogues are all contemporary articles from gaming magazines that chronicle the development and release of the game. As to the playthrough itself, large parts of the game are free roaming, some of them entirely optional, with nothing coercing you into following any one particular path. This can be an issue for a story-based game, as it may result in missing plot points or getting them out of order. I'm going to play the game in what I call story order, which will show us every room and force us to solve every puzzle. As it will be a perfect run, deaths and dead ends will be relegated to the appendices, one for each chapter. In an addendum at the very end, we'll explore some additional game-related material that, while it didn't fit anywhere else, can't be overlooked.